Most definitely. It brings credibility to the organization, and the very process of doing it brings visibility to your organization.
So how long does this take? And approximately what would be the cost range to do something like this?
I'm going to share here, people want to know, what does this mind mapping look like? What do these things look like? And these are just sort of quick, giving you an idea of what this software looks like. So it's creative, it's unique, it's visually stimulating, and that's great too. It gets away from those lengthy reports.
So let's say I'm the executive director of a nonprofit. I've convinced my board that we need to invest in this evaluation. The board agrees, and we have to decide, what we're going to budget and how long is this going to take. Time is always of the essence. And if you're an executive director, you're probably already overworked and your time is already taken up along with your staff. Nonprofits tend to run a little thin because of their budget. So how long does this take? And approximately what would be the cost range to do something like this?
One of the things that I love about this, and we get a lot of positive feedback on, is the time efficiency. It's not a lot of work for staff. Like there's initial planning. What do you want to get out of it? Who are the core audiences we're targeting here? But then we'll do the convening either virtually or in person, and we do these in 2-hour sessions. So in 2-hour sessions, they'll be given a prompt in advance. They come into the 2-hour session. We do working agreements, get everybody on the same page, mutual understanding of the process, and then we're sort of pairing people up. They're sharing some stories. We're giving them some guidance on appreciative inquiry techniques, and then coming back to the larger group and then visually mapping it, and everybody's sharing their insights and getting a lot of that, creating that generative space of content. So then we map that information, and then sometimes that's it. The organization just really wants to see the maps, and other times it's a more involved report. And it might be one session where we're coming in and doing this with one particular audience, or it might be like the one I mentioned earlier, where we did 5 different sessions with 5 different audiences, and then do a lot of analysis. So it's obviously very customized, but it can be $1,500 to $2,000 at the sort of the low end of this work to much higher, depending on the size of the organization, the number of these sessions, the level of analysis, that kind of stuff. But definitely getting that information early on in your project can be beneficial to write it into your grant proposal. I certainly, and I know other consultants do pro bono work as well. There's opportunities to collaborate, to do this with other organizations for the purpose of meeting those common agendas for multiple organizations that are doing this work in communities. That's challenging, complex work, and this can cut through that.
So basically, a consultant would sit down with them and they would talk about what they're trying to accomplish, and they would come up with some kind of a number and time commitment and so on and so forth. Because one size does not fit all. But I think that $1,500 to come in and do an initial assessment is great. And I guess my feeling is that if you have a really solid evaluation, especially program evaluation, you can go to funders and be much more impressive on your grant proposal because you've got a track record. And I always tell people when I'm teaching grant proposal writing, look, you got to think of going to a foundation or a funder like going to the bank. They want to know what your credibility is. They want to know what your track record is. They want to know what you expect as an ROI. Now, not financially, but socially. What is the social ROI and how do they play into all that? What is their role in that? And so I think if you can answer a lot of those questions, it certainly makes funders more confident in supporting your cause and your organization.
Most definitely. It brings credibility to the organization, and the very process of doing it brings visibility to your organization. The participants come away feeling like, this is an organization that cares about the feedback of who care most about this particular issue. So it has a very high capacity to increase visibility and credibility to a funder and to your community partners, for sure.
Yeah, and my experience, especially in academia, has been they get a grant. Usually, it's a government grant in academia. It's usually not a donor. Well, sometimes a donor, but anyway, they're usually research grants. And about 6 months in, all of a sudden they realize, uh-oh, we have to give a report
Yeah.
on what we've done, and they have done no work to put that report together. So they run around like crazy people trying to put this report together that's due in 3 days. And it's a mess. And
Mm.
funders know when something's well put together or not. Would this help them do that? Would this help them in the reporting process?
Yeah, very much so. It takes, I mean, you can do these in a pretty rapid turnaround, but I mean, sort of the sweet spot for just a single REM of convening and generating a lot of, information from that. We usually need a couple of weeks to get a group convened and then carry out the 2 hour process and then follow up with another couple of weeks of analysis. So it kind of depends. Sometimes it's far more involved than that, but you can turn it around in a month, right? If you need a report a month from now and you're anticipating that, it's a great way to sort of say, all right, we weren't anticipating this level of evaluation. Let's use this method, pull people together. And from that, it usually starts to crystallize then those next steps for the next report.
Well, yeah, and I think that it certainly says something about your credibility as a nonprofit to the funder that, hey, these people are on top of it. They know what they're doing. They're taking our funding seriously and investing it in a way that really gives us social return on our investment. And I think that's so important. I hate to say this, but there are a lot of nonprofits that take the money and the donor never hears from them again, whether it's a foundation or the government or whatever, until it's time to get more money.
Right.
And that's not a good thing. So I'm thinking that this kind of ripple effect tool would be very helpful to them to do as they go along.
That's right. So I'm going to share here. People want to know, what does this mind mapping look like? What do these things look like? And these are just sort of quick, giving you an idea of what this software looks like, right? But the software I use is called XMind, XMIND. I've been using it for years. I love it. There's lots of other softwares, Miro, Mural, Kumu. There's a lot of different technology has really made this type of thing more available now. But so in this case, we were just sort of mapping individual stories, and then they were collectively as a group reflecting on the impacts of different stories. Then we started to identify the greater themes. But this is a lot easier to read than a lengthy report, whether you're a funder or a donor or whomever, right? And this is, for the most part, these are collected anonymously. Depending on the project, we determine, with the client, determine what makes most sense there. So we try to make it playful and approachable, and yet there's a lot of content in these maps that speaks volumes in terms of information shared. So it's creative, it's unique, it's visually stimulating, and that's great too. It gets away from those lengthy reports.
So if our listeners want a copy of this map for the reference, do they just go to your website and download it? Is that possible or what?
There are examples of maps on the site. There's reports on our site, and yeah, and they can reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk to their decision makers and educate them more on the value of it.
Okay, well, I'll put some links below.
Perfect.
And also your website will be on the screen so they can just go to your website. We'll put your email there. We'll put links to help them out. And hopefully this would be very helpful to nonprofit organizations. I know that because I've never heard of this mapping system before, evaluation was always a daunting task because it involves quantitative and qualitative. It involves surveying. And one of the problems is nonprofits don't often keep good data records. And as a result, when they go back to use that, it's not there. So do you help them set up systems like this when you do this to so that they have the information they need?
Specifically, that hasn't been a priority for sort of using the REM process, but it's a great question in the sense that yes, it's a barrier for many organizations. But now we're getting into sort of those more philosophical questions about capacity when organizations, especially young grassroots, passionate, leaders are starting new organizations. We're in spaces right now where collaboration is key. Collaboration is huge. The synergies of addressing complex social issues that come from multiple organizations working together are substantially more powerful than a one organization trying to solve, a complex issue. So REM works beautifully to foster those collaborations, but its target is not to set up quantitative evaluation systems as a result. Although I do see that stuff emerge quite a bit from it in terms of ideas or frankly convincing those who maybe weren't supportive of it and moving the needle on that.
I like what you say about collaboration and its necessity because the problems we're facing, you got to hit it from all different angles. And one of the challenges, I think, is getting nonprofits to understand that because I think nonprofits, we sometimes think that our mission is more important than other missions. And we don't think in terms of, okay, we do this, but we don't do these two or three other things. Who else does that? And how can
Yeah.
we collaborate to go in and try to solve this problem, try to make the world a better place? So, but collaboration is not easy, but the easier we can make it, the better, right?
I agree. I agree. And then and one of the next things that you and I talked about talking about next is going to get into some of that collaboration stuff as well and
Okay,
some
well
other
then,
mapping tools we can use for that.
well, why don't we talk about collaboration then? How's that?
All right.
Okay.
Sounds
All
good.
right. Janet Hansel has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to program and organizational evaluation and ripple effects mapping, but her expertise doesn't stop there. If you want to be notified of more of her videos, please like and subscribe to this channel. Now, because Janet was a former Community Foundation officer, she understands how foundations evaluate nonprofit grant proposals. And in this next video, she talks about a very powerful way to impress a foundation with your proposal through creating collaborations with other nonprofits. You want to know how? Well, watch here.